And as you heard earlier on, former President Kgalema Motlanthe is now the chair of the Champions, a group of African elders fighting the scourge of HIV/AIDS. Today, the group launched the new offices in Sandton, South Africa, where now have the co-sponsor of the Champions, Aspen Pharmacare's Stavros Nikolai, who is Group Senior Executive for Strategic Trade. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Sepisan. Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's talk about some of the concerns that were raised about, obviously, the infection rate in South Africa amongst the highest, especially amongst the most vulnerable group, the youngest, which is between 18 and 24. And we have more cases. So does that concern you as Aspen, just in terms of whether we are stemming the high infection rate in South Africa?
Okay, so I think today when we hosted the Champions and there was a transfer of chairmanship to South Africa in the form of President Motlanthe, it's important to reflect on the work that the Champions do. And the Champions are 14 elders, mainly former statesmen and women, that took leadership positions in their respective countries to turn the tide against the HIV pandemic, where it was at its most pronounced, which is on the African continent, particularly in South Africa and Botswana. South Africa remains the epicenter of the HIV virus. We have 7.6 million infected South Africans and roughly about 5 million on antiretroviral treatment. So although much has been achieved in turning the tide against the pandemic, there are many new challenges. And the discussion was around two new challenges today. The first challenge was that young people are still being infected at unacceptable rates. And that's a new cause or new challenge that the Champions will take on. And we will obviously, at an advocacy level, we will support them where we can. It's a private sector. Aspen is housing the Champions Secretariat for the next 3 years at its offices. So that is a program we will become immersed into to some extent.
Of course, Stavros, this all occurs within the context of the SDG 2030 goals of an AIDS-free Africa, in South Africa. That is something that we're still grappling with. And one of the major complications that we've seen, some people, because of nutrition issues, aren't consistent with taking medication. But we've also had lots of stockouts, which the health department has said some it can fix, some it can't fix. And I'd imagine security of medication supply is something that's concerning you as well. No,
in fact, Piso, that was the second challenge we discussed today. So in the midst of the uncertainty that the coronavirus presents, and the uncertainty that it presents in this context and in the security of supply of medicines and ensuring we have sustainable medicine supply to patients, it's important to note that local producers like Aspen import the raw materials. They're called the active pharmaceutical ingredients. So those are the active ingredients that we import into the country and then we convert into the final tablet or capsule that the patient eventually consumes. So being a local producer does give the country greater security in supply in the midst of a pandemic or an emerging pandemic. It's not quite declared a pandemic yet, like COVID-19, the coronavirus. But what it does do at the same time is it gives you the ability to import the material, to produce it, and to strategically stockpile as a country. Unfortunately, we haven't started strategically stockpiling. And I'm going to come back in a second and explain what I mean exactly by that. The other way we receive medicines into the country is fully imported products. Now, when you start having a diversion of medicine supplies to other markets because there is a coronavirus and supplies are being strategically reallocated globally, you have to secure your supply here in South Africa. And you can better do that if you are producing locally. But it then means, and we are currently, as I speak to you, in fact, I just got off the line now with the health department on my way here. We are in conversations with them to see how we can strategically stockpile the raw materials.
What would that entail? I mean, given our partnerships within the BRICS area, that should facilitate easier negotiations, but we also have to be capacitated to be able to do that.
We can, so it's actually quite simple. It's sitting down and working out which are the most high-risk products in the country. Now, the most consumed pharmaceuticals in South Africa are antiretrovirals. So there's 5 million plus South Africans on ARVs. It's by far the most consumed product. What we should be doing, and what we're currently in discussions with the health department on, is which are those antiretrovirals we need to strategically secure, strategically stockpile. That would mean we take a view on how long is this uncertainty or constraint in supply going to be. Do we estimate it's going to be 3 or 6 months? And in fairness, the health department has called manufacturers and suppliers to a meeting about 10 days ago. They are following the WHO guidelines in terms of precautionary measures that need to take place. And if we remain unaffected at this point in time, because you do, in any production cycle, you bring in sufficient raw material, you then produce sufficient buffer stock. So we fine as a country till the end of May.
Okay. I want to ask you something before we run out of time, Stavros.
Sure.
Now, if we talk about the coronavirus and its inherent complications, obviously people who are HIV positive have a compromised immune system. So you were speaking about from an advocacy point of view, how would you then speak to South Africans about it? It hasn't come to our shores yet, but we want to make sure that, for instance, people who are HIV positive are taking their medication, are eating well, are healthy, so that they aren't vulnerable to this.
Okay, so I think there are two responses there. The first is corona. It's not the virus that kills you.
No,
it's the secondary infections that you get. So there are precautions, and Dr. Angelique earlier set those out. There are precautions one needs to take. So, for example, if you're going to be traveling and you're vulnerable people are the elderly, people that are immunocompromised, people that would travel with infants, for example, pregnant women. Those are all the vulnerable groups. So those groups in particular have to take precautions. That means don't travel to highly contagious areas. If you are going to have contact, try and limit the contact. So those are basic precautions that the public needs to take. Of course, the ideal thing would be, if you're going to have risky interactions, that you have a mask. But we also just heard that masks are in short supply. So that's the one thing we need to do. The second thing is we need to gear up strategically with key pharmaceutical products in the country. Antiretrovirals are amongst those. The antibacterials or antimicrobials that would treat secondary infections. Because remember, it's a secondary infection like pneumonia. That is the part, that's the thing that actually kills you, not the virus per se. So those are the things, those are the two things we need to do as a country, and that's what I would also communicate to the general public out there. If you are in those vulnerable groups, limit your contact, limit your travel. But
also, I suppose, just practice, basic hygiene, washing your hands, sanitizing your surfaces, etc.
Absolutely. I believe hand sanitizer sales have gone through the roof. I'm not surprised.
Well, we shouldn't be. And thank you so much for joining us. Stavros Nicolaou is Group Senior Executive Strategic Trade at Aspen Pharmacare.